Hello everyone, I hope that you are having a good week and that all your classes are going well and all of that. So this week I wanted to talk a little bit about Seymour Chatman's journal article, What Novels Can Do That Films Can't and Vice Versa. So we were using that article for our objective summary assignments. Where I was teaching you how to build an objective summary, and then you will be subsequently required to utilize some of the ideas from this particular essay in your next paper, so the film and literature paper. So I thought it was really important that despite the fact that you have done the objective summary exercise on this, since we're not together person to person or in person rather, this semester, that I go over the sort of concepts that are within this essay and make sure to give a little bit more explanation of them to make sure that you understand the concepts that he's trying to get across in this particular essay. As I'm sure was kind of apparent just based on the first part of the Chatman objective summary exercise, Chatman discusses the process from going to a book to a film version of a story, right? So he starts off his essay with a little bit of background. He talks a little bit about what film scholars have talked about in the past regarding the process of adaptation. And so he brings up things like semiotics and narratology and some other scholars that are pretty big in those areas. But he basically boils what he has to say in the beginning down to the following. First of all, he talks about how any medium, and when I say medium here, it means like any communication delivering process, right? Like a play or a radio program or a novel or a television show or a song or a book, right? So there are different storytelling mediums, like a film, right? And so any medium that can display both story time or the actual sequence of events of something. So for example, someone is born, they are a baby, they are a toddler, they are a child, they are an adolescent, they are a teenager, they are a young adult, they are middle-aged, they get old, and they pass away, right? So that's like the actual sequence of events of someone's life, right? So if a medium can display that, but also display what he terms discourse time, meaning an ability to tell a story basically out of order, right? Or in whatever order. So perhaps you have a book where it starts off with an old man on his deathbed, and then he's recounting a story in time to his granddaughter, let's say. And then the next chapter in the novel does basically a flashback to the time that he's telling his granddaughter about, and telling the stories almost like as though it's in that time, right? So discourse time then is the ordering of events within a story, right? So it's not necessarily the real time of events, or not necessarily in the actual sequence that it occurred, but rather the order in which it is being told to someone, right? So basically any medium that has the ability to tell a story both in real time or story time, or using discourse time, or, and possibly disordered or reconstructed order of events, then it is capable of telling a story, okay? Or it is capable of narrative. Story and narrative are similar terms, are not exactly the same. Story is actual, usually the actual sequence of events. Narrative is more closely related to discourse time. So potentially it is out of sequence, right? So he basically tells us that there are a lot of different mediums that can do this, right? Plays can do this, a film can do this, a television episode or a television series can do this. Technically a song could tell us about the events of someone's life from, either chronologically or not. A book, there's all kinds of different mediums that are capable of displaying both story time and discourse time. So this, in part, is probably why we see the same story told many different times over or through several different mediums, right? We might have an Alice in Wonderland as a stage production. We might see Alice in Wonderland as a book, or read it as a book rather. We might see a film that is Alice in Wonderland, right? Because those mediums have the ability to tell these stories, right? Because they have the ability to show those two time sequences. And so therefore people are probably interested in potentially seeing a story in these different mediums, and because they can tell the story based on their, relative attributes as specific mediums, then someone can, in essence, utilize that medium to tell a story, whether it's a retelling of a story or whatever. Now, at this point, Seymour Chatman basically relays to the audience that in the early days of film scholarship, where they were looking at the process of adaptation, scholars noticed that, stories could be told in different mediums. The same story, in fact, could be told in different mediums. But far too often, he says, they were looking at what made the adaptations the same, right? So if a book came first, oftentimes people would try and see what stayed the same from the book version of a story to whatever medium it was retold in, right? So if we have the book, what stayed the same between the book and the film, for example, right? So he says, though, that by scholars doing it this way, they often missed out on very important and interesting ways in which a story necessarily had to change based on the medium it was told in. So basically, because because a story was told in a book, for example, it's going to have certain features, and that particular medium is going to be able to tell that story in a specific way. Versus if it's on film, it's going to have a different set of criteria by which it can relay that story to the audience, right? In a book, it uses primarily written words. In a film, it's usually showing us moving pictures, right? So the fact that these mediums are made up of or are able to tell stories in different ways based on the strengths or weaknesses of that medium necessarily indicates to us that if we change a story from one medium to another, there are going to probably be necessary changes to the way that story is told to us based on the limits, the strengths, and whatnot of the medium in which it's being told. Okay? So one of the first things that Chatman points out is this idea of description versus point of view. So when he talks about description, he's primarily talking about the way in which information is relayed to us, a reader, in a book, right? Things are described to us in books. And what he says about this is that while we are receiving descriptive passages in the form of the written word or in a book, for example, story time stops, right? But discourse time continues. We are still in the story, right? The story continues, but the action of the characters and whatnot pauses for a moment as things are described to us. Okay, so for example, I'm going to read you a passage and then we're going to talk about it for a moment. So here's the passage. The old man ate his breakfast, got dressed, and then walked to the park. When he arrived, he found a small bench under an oak tree where he sat to enjoy the crisp morning air. Down a small hill sat an old swing set on the property of the grade school. The plastic pieces were faded and cracked. The metals were showing spots of coppery rust. A brontosaurus and flamingo, each with handles stuck through their necks, creaked as the wild spits of wind forced them to rock against the will of the rusty springs that pierced both their bellies and the ground. Small sprigs of grass and sprouts of weeds were attempting to overbear the diminishing number of wood chips that once generously lined the playground's bed. The old man thought back to a time when his children used to run around that playset, long before the disrepair and the disappearance of the investment in public schools. He walked over to it to take in the disrepair a bit closer. So in this instance, so that's the end of the passage. So in this instance, the man at the park's story is paused for a moment while the narrator describes the park. Okay. So we don't know necessarily what is happening with this man as these things are being described to us, right? So we know that he sat down under a bench, but then as his surroundings are described, we don't necessarily know what the old man is doing, right? So the story has stopped for a moment while this description is being given up to us or provided to us via the narrator of a story, right? So the discourse time continues. We are still in the book. We're reading pieces of the book or part of the story. But the story time itself, like the man's actual sequence of events, because presumably this old man is the protagonist and we're supposed to be following him and his activities, right? His activities have paused for us. We don't necessarily have ongoing action there where we know exactly what's going on with him in each moment, right? That part of the story or the story time pauses, okay? Now, Chatman tells us that the force of film and the movement in film forces the story to always keep going. So what tends to happen then is instead of things being described to us via film, it is presented to us, right? Or it is depicted, right? So they have to show us something. Oftentimes these become sort of shots that show someone else's point of view. So if we were to take that passage that I read to you about the old man, we can imagine that if perhaps that were to be adapted into a film, we might see instead a shot of a man getting up in the morning, eating his breakfast and taking a stroll to a park. We might see him sit down on that bench. We might see a close-up of his face and then it might pan around so we can see the park that he is looking at. So when we see a close-up of someone's face and then a camera pans out to show us kind of their surroundings, it becomes sort of assumed by we, the audience members of a film, that those whatever that camera is showing us is basically the point of view or the sort of eyesight of the character or the protagonist, right? This is something that they are taking in. So in this sense, the story time doesn't stop. Instead, we are just seeing what the man is seeing, right? And it's not that clear cut in a novel, right? In a film, the force and pressure of the movement of film in essence forces the story time to continue. And as such, showing us the landscape in that way, and presumably from the man's perspective, it means that the story time hasn't stopped in the way that it does in say a book where something is being described to us, right? Instead, they just show us something that the man is seeing, right? It becomes clear in the book as well, or that passage, right? That it's something the man was looking at, right? But we don't know that. It isn't immediately clear until later in the paragraph, right? So as the story time has stalled, right, for that moment of that description, we don't necessarily, again, know what that man was doing during that time, right? Whereas it is more apparent that it is something the man is looking at in the filmic version, okay? So basically, Chatman is arguing here that there are certain ambiguities in a novel that cannot be ambiguous in a film. Something needs to be concrete, right? So let's explore this a little bit more. So let's say that we are reading a novel and it says something like, the child started playing with the little red toy. Okay. Now, if we're reading a book, that description, well, it stalls the time of the book for a moment, right? Just for a very small moment, right? Where it's describing the toy. So it stalls the story time for just like a very small moment there. But the other thing about this is it gives us very few details, right? We know it's little, we know it's red, and we know it's a toy, right? But what size is little, right? We will probably fill this in with our imaginations, but what I imagine as the little red toy and what you imagine as the little red toy and what someone else across the planet thinks of as the little red toy might be completely different, right? I might be picturing a little mahogany, like reddish wood top, right? Where you just spin it, right? Someone else might be imagining a bright cherry red doll of sorts, right? Or a doll that's wearing a cherry red dress or something. We're all going to have different, or somebody else might do like a fire engine red truck or something, right? We don't know. None of us really know if those are correct or what the author meant by a little red toy, right? We're just sort of filling in with our imagination what might have been, right? What might have been meant there. Now, a film cannot be ambiguous like that, right? When someone goes and adapts that into a filmic form, they have to show the audience something, right? So that little red toy must become a concrete object, right? So the director of the film is going to have to make choices, how little is little, right? What shade of red, what kind of toy, right? Those kinds of ambiguities cannot exist in film in the way that they can exist in a book, right? So that becomes sort of a fundamental difference in the way that a story can be told in a book form versus the way a story can be told on film, right? The best basically that a director can hope for is that they can come to some sort of agreement or decision about what that little red toy is that will satisfy the vast sum of the audience, right? Which becomes kind of a guessing game, and probably why so many people have disagreements about what is better, the book or the film, right? This is a debate that we have all the time. And a lot of these debates come from the idea that a story has to be told kind of differently between one medium and the other, right? Now, there are some purists that think just because a book came first, for example, that it is the definitive version, that is the best version, right? But that's not necessarily true, right? While each of these mediums tell stories differently, and necessarily because of the way that their medium in particular operates or its strengths and weaknesses, whatnot, we need to sort of view, this kind of comes down to the ultimate argument that Chatman makes near the end of the essay, is that because different mediums necessarily require different modes of storytelling based on the abilities, strengths, weaknesses, limitations, whatever, of whatever medium it is being told in, it seems kind of unfair to be like, hey, the book is just automatically better or fundamentally better or something like that, right? Because really, you're kind of comparing apples and oranges in some ways, right? They're both fruits, in this case, both stories, but these sort of elements within them are different, right? An apple is sort of it's got a different texture and slightly different flavor, and you can, fairly easily eat the peel, right? Whereas an orange, typically you don't eat the peel. I mean, there are limited things you might use it in, but you don't usually just chomp into an orange and eat the peel raw, at least not most people. it's sour and, the slices come apart. Whereas an apple, you just either bite into it or you have to slice it manually, right? So there are different properties to an apple and an orange, just as there are different properties to an apple or an orange, to a novel and a film. And, you could kind of keep that analogy going, right? Cherries are like a radio show and a banana is like a stage play, right? So these different items have different elements and qualities by which we should probably individually judge them, right? Just because you don't like a cherry doesn't mean that you're not going to like a banana, right? Whereas just because you didn't like the stage play of Alice in Wonderland doesn't necessarily mean that you won't like the film version, for example, right? And so really, ultimately, Chatman's argument sort of comes down to we need to sort of watch how stories are told differently in different mediums, but also that they should be judged not according to or against one another per se, but rather as their own entities, right? Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that we won't have, now this is me sort of editorializing a little bit beyond Chatman's work, so keep that in mind. This is not necessarily part of his argument. But as you're working on your film and literature paper, I do want you to take the film and literature pairing that you came up with or you were looking at for your paper. And by the end, I do want you to have sort of an idea of which you think conveyed the story better. But I want you to make that argument based on, looking deeply at the way the story is told in the book versus the way the story was told in the filmic version, and sort of give me an idea of why you think that one was better at telling that particular story than the other. What would have made it better? How were they different? How were they the same? But also, which one do you think was more effective in telling the story? Now, that is a subjective claim. Now, you're going to want to save that to the end of the paper, right? During your introduction, where you talk a little bit about Chatman and his ideas about the differences between film and literary versions of stories, you're going to want to keep those pieces objective. And when you're in the body of your paper and you're comparing and contrasting these certain scenes or descriptive passages versus depicted items in a film, you want to keep those pieces objective, right? Keep your own evaluation and whatnot out of it, right? You want to remain fairly objective in those pieces of the paper. But by the time you get to the end of the paper, I'm fine in your conclusion if you have an opinion about, in this case, which was more effective, as long as you explain why, and using terminology and things like that that are appropriate to a film and literature sort of paper, right? The film was better because it really allowed me to sort of see the world better, whereas the novel version gave such little description that it was sort of hard to understand, what was going on, right? Or I liked the book version better because they gave some really great details that allowed my mind to just explode with imagination about what this world is, whereas it was a little lackluster in the film, considering the kind of tools that they had at their disposal, right? So these are kind of things that you can kind of consider in the end of your paper. I'll allow you to get a little bit more subjective with it, but in the most of the paper, so like your introduction through your body, you're going to want to try to remain as objective as possible, right? Meaning keeping your own emotions and feelings about it out. You want to be sort of objective in the way that you discern, this is what happened in the movie version, this is how it was this was how it was described in the book versus this is how it was depicted in the film, right? So keep that kind of in mind. Okay, so I hope this was helpful. I know this is one of the more challenging assignments is the objective summary, because you're being introduced to very academic style writing and being asked to both read it and understand it. And I know this is something that's new to most of you, and it probably was a challenge to just about every one of you. I'm certain it is every semester. But this is a style of writing that you're going to want to immerse yourself in a little bit more because you're going to be seeing more of it as you continue as a student, okay? And so using the objective summary sort of format that I taught you is a good step in the right direction of trying to pick apart and try to understand these more densely worded sorts of ideological sort of papers, right? And so keep that in mind. But you are going to be expected to sort of understand how to dip your toe in and try to understand those kinds of works. And that provides you like a sort of systematic way of understanding. The objective summary does. Okay, so if you have questions about the Seymour Chatman article or about your film and lit paper more generally, of course, you can always feel free to let me know, okay? I will see you all soon. Thanks for watching, and we have conferences next week, so I'll see you then. Bye.